Our top story today, Sir Keir Starmer has told his front bench to prepare for a spring general election.
The Labour leader reportedly wants to finalise a manifesto in February in anticipation of the country going to the polls in May. Joining us now is political correspondent at The Spectator, James Heale. James, Sir Keir preparing for a spring fight. Is he right to do so?
I think it's probably a sensible move because this is all about making sure Labour's policies are bomb-proofed, making sure the ducks are in a line, and that their sums will crucially add up. We're very aware, obviously, the Conservatives are going to go on the attack come the election. They're going to try and paint Labour as the party of fiscal irresponsibility. And so, therefore, this is about making sure they're prepared for spring, even though there's a debate within government about maybe doing it in autumn instead.
James, on that point of making sure that their figures add up, actually some of the small print of what the Labour Party is saying, I think is really interesting. Some of the newspapers saying that as a result of Keir Starmer saying it's going to be a spring election, therefore we need to get our policies, they're not going to bother to have the full shadow spending review. In other words, they're not going to bother to tell us all what the figures look like because they're saying they haven't got time. That seems quite convenient to me.
Yes, this is the small print of the result of that story, isn't it? I mean, the problem is, of course, is that, Labour have said all along they're not going to actually tell us what the sums add up to until they can see what the books look like closer to an election. And the danger is, of course, that now we are only 6 months out from that, and we still don't know how the sums will up, particularly with that 28 billion Green New Deal.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a central attack point of the Conservatives in the next 6 months or so. And I think the question does become is how much do Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt try to exploit that by making, say, in the next 18 months, we've got to have a spending review. How do they try and take the fight to Labour and try and press home an advantage there?
One of the biggest criticisms of Starmer is that we don't really know what he's for. Say what you want about Corbyn, but you knew where he stood on pretty much every issue, right? We still don't know who Keir Starmer is.
Well, it hasn't hurt him this far, has it? I think we're now out, expecting an election this year and he's sort of 20 points ahead in the polls. I think really it's about trying to minimise any kind of areas in which the Conservatives can get an advantage and try and avoid any policy discussions that could blow up, a bit like 2017 when, of course, the dementia tax really derailed Theresa May's campaign. And the two sides will be fighting, trying to find defining issues on which they can fight an election. Is it going to be about asylum or is it going to be about public services, cost of living, etc.?
And on the asylum and immigration, of course, other interesting stories around today. Many people saying the timing of the election could well be reliant on what happens to the Rwanda bill when it comes back to Parliament in January if Rishi Sunak loses it, either to the left of his party or to the right of his party, because both could be quite unhappy. That might mean that the election is brought forward, or it might mean that the election's pushed back. But meanwhile, the Labour Party trying to get in on the act on immigration stories with their own immigration policy flag-waving.
Yes, this is a big whole thing in Labour's policy, which is that they can all talk about trying to smash the criminal gangs. We can all get behind that. But as the head of the National Crime Agency has pointed out, you need an effective deterrent to stop those coming here. And Labour have made a lot of hay out of criticising Rwanda, but now they've said they're going to accept the offshore principle scheme of offshore processing of asylum claims. And that's interesting because I think at that point it becomes not just about Rwanda, but about the broad principle. So I think Labour are sensibly readjusting on this.
And on that, I found it fascinating over the weekend and over the Christmas period. Lots of briefing going on about, don't you remember when the Labour Party thought about offshoring? In other words, sending asylum seekers or illegal immigrants to other countries. And they were been talking about how David Blunkett was talking about this 20 years ago.
Well, quite, because as you get into government and you end up doing unpalatable things because you need to deal with this as an issue. And of course, it's not just, what happened 20 years ago, it's also what other governments across Europe are embracing now. And the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, to give one example, the Social Democrats there have had to embrace a whole wave of anti-immigration measures because they're responding to populist anger. So I think that Labour are sensibly trying to address this now before an election rather than deal with it in government.
And do you think this manifesto, if it comes, is going to separate Starmer and Sunak more so? Because currently, another criticism of Starmer is Sunak light, right? They both got elected in 2015 as MPs. They're both good at paperwork, but lacking charisma in front of the camera. And they seem to have very similar policies. Obviously, the Tories have stolen a few of Labour's ideas, but they just seem very similar.
Yeah, I think that it's fair to say that since 2019, the Tories probably shifted to the left and Labour shifted to the right. And so how do you deal with that? What I will say about the manifesto from talking to some people in and around the shadow cabinet is they expect it to be a much slimmer document. So only about, I think the last one was about 96 pages. This one probably about sort of 40 or 50 or so. And so I think that'll be interesting. And I think, as you say, the sort of areas of potential difference will be very much more different from last time when there was a whole wave of policies where you could criticise things like culture wars, etc., on the economy. So I think it'll be about minimising those differences and trying to exploit the areas areas in which Labour has an advantage.
Do you really think that the Tories have moved to the left since 2019? I mean, many people see, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak as to the right of where the party used to be.
Well, I think you look at the size of the state where we are now post-COVID spending, you look at how the public services have just completely ballooned since then without the kind of efficiency goals that you saw earlier 10 years ago in the coalition parliament. I think there's a strong case to suggest that, and I think that's looking around the party, they are, if anything, the people most annoying in British politics right now are the right to Conservative Party.
So who's going to pick up those floating voters, those people who feel homeless?
Well, I think there'll be two things that will happen. One of which is that we reform, you'll see some of them 5% going there, and the other which you'll see a lot of voters stay home, just like in 1997, when, of course, led to Tony Blair's landslide.